In 1877, in the fractured backwoods of post-Reconstruction Virginia, two asylum patients, separated by 100 miles of muddy roads and whispering pines, began sharing a single, impossible life. They had never met. They had never spoken. Yet in the quiet, sterile wards of their respective institutions, they would begin to dream the same dream, draw the same house, and answer to the same name. A name that belonged to a man who, according to the state, had never been born. This is not a story of madness, but of a connection so profound, so terrifyingly precise, that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of identity. It began not with a scream, but with a clerical error, a simple piece of paper flagged for duplication in the cavernous archives of the Virginia Bureau of Vital Statistics. The year was marked by a fragile peace. The scars of the Civil War were still fresh, and the air was thick with a desire for order, for reason, for science to tame the wildness of the human mind. It was a time when asylums were seen not as places of healing, but as storehouses for the socially inconvenient, the spiritually broken, and the mentally shattered. Into this world of rigid categorization came an anomaly that defied every known label. The first patient, designated male subject 412, was admitted to the St. Thaddeus Infirmary for the mentally afflicted, a grim brick fortress west of Richmond. He was found wandering a railroad track, unable to state his name or origin, his only possessions a worn coat and a single, smooth river stone clutched in his palm. His intake physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, noted his condition as ambulatory catatonia with fugue state, a catch-all diagnosis for a mind that had simply walked away from itself. Across the state, in the secluded Coleridge Women's Facility, a sprawling campus of whitewashed buildings and manicured lawns that hid a core of profound neglect, female subject 307B was admitted under similar circumstances. She'd been discovered sitting motionless on a church pew 2 days after Sunday service had ended, her gaze fixed on the stained glass depiction of the resurrection. She was nonverbal, her face a mask of placid indifference. Her file read acute melancholia, another convenient term for a soul that had gone silent. For weeks, they were just numbers in a system designed to process, not to understand. Their cases were unremarkable, two more casualties of an era rife with displacement and trauma. The anomaly was triggered by a junior clerk named Arthur Penwright, a man whose meticulous nature bordered on obsession. His task was to cross-reference institutional intake forms against census data, a tedious process of hunting for ghosts in the machine of bureaucracy. He flagged the two files not for what they contained, but for what they shared. On two separate forms filed on the same day in two different counties, the space reserved for distinguishing marks or scars bore the exact same description, written in two different doctors' hands. A faint, crescent-shaped scar above the left collarbone, approximately 1 inch in length, appearing to be of significant age. Coincidence was common. Identical phrasing from two separate physicians was not. Penwright, following protocol, submitted a query for clarification. The response he received was a single, hand-delivered note from a regional administrator, bearing no signature. It contained only 3 words: cease inquiry, refile separately. Arthur Penwright was a man who understood the unspoken rules of his position. He refiled the documents as instructed, but not before making a private copy of both entries, an act of quiet defiance that would preserve the first clue to a mystery that was never meant to be solved. The true depth of the connection began to surface not in the ledgers of clerks, but in the hushed, lamplit corridors of the asylums themselves. At St. Thaddeus, Dr. Finch began a series of memory exercises with subject 412, hoping to anchor his fractured identity. He presented the man with a series of pastoral images: farms, rivers, forests. When shown a photograph of a dilapidated wooden boathouse on a still, black pond, the patient's placid demeanor shattered. His pulse skyrocketed, his breath hitched, and for the first time he spoke. The words came out in a hoarse whisper, disjointed but clear. "The third plank," he said, his eyes wide with a terror that felt ancient. "The third plank was loose. The water it was not cold, it was hungry. He described a childhood incident with chilling lucidity. A sibling, a game of chase, the crack of rotting wood, and the silent, terrifying plunge into the dark water below. He spoke of the guilt, the recurring nightmare of a hand slipping from his grasp. Dr. Finch documented it as a breakthrough, a core traumatic memory, the likely source of his fugue state. He noted the patient's emotional distress and prescribed a regimen of rest and hydrotherapy. It was a textbook case of trauma-induced amnesia. But 100 miles away, at Coalbridge, subject 307B was undergoing a similar evaluation. Her therapist, a young, forward-thinking nurse named Clara Me, employed art as a means of communication. When given charcoal and paper, the silent woman began to draw. She drew compulsively, obsessively, the same image over and over, a wooden boathouse on a still, black pond. And in every single drawing, the third plank from the edge of the dock was rendered with a dark, jagged line, signifying a break. When Nurse Me gently pressed her for details, the woman finally spoke, her voice raspy from disuse. "I pulled him out," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I pulled him out, but he never forgave me for the fall." The two accounts, locked away in separate patient files, were perfect mirror images of the same event, one told from the perspective of the rescuer, the other from the one who fell. Neither institution was aware of the other's findings. In the fragmented world of 19th-century psychiatric care, communication between facilities was virtually non-existent, reserved only for the transfer of the most violent or politically sensitive patients. These two were neither. They were invisible, lost souls in a system that had already forgotten them. The first person to see both sides of the story was Dr. Wesley Thorne, a visiting consultant for the State Board of Mental Hygiene. Thorne was a man of science, a devout believer in logic and empirical evidence, but he also harbored a private fascination with anomalies of the mind, cases that bent the rules of his profession. While conducting a routine audit of patient therapy notes, he stumbled upon the Coalbridge drawings. The sheer repetition was unusual, but it was the consistency of the broken plank that snagged his attention. Weeks later, during a similar audit at St. Thaddeus, he read Dr. Finch's notes on subject 412's breakthrough. The description of the pond, the dock, the fall, it was more than similar. It was a verbatim transcript of the scene depicted in the woman's drawings. Thorne felt a cold dread creep up his spine, the kind that comes when the orderly world of facts begins to fray at the edges. He requested the files for both patients, citing a need to compare therapeutic methodologies. The request was granted, but what he found inside would set him on a dangerous path, one that led away from the comfortable certainties of medicine and into a shadow world of suppressed knowledge and whispered warnings. The files contained two lives that had never intersected, yet they were bound by a memory that belonged to both, and to neither. As Dr. Thorne laid the two files side by side in his Richmond office, the impossibilities began to stack up like pages in a madman's diary. Their birthplaces were recorded as being over 200 miles apart, one in the mountainous region of the West, the other in the coastal flatlands. Their listed ages were within a year of each other, but their physical descriptions were starkly different. He was tall and gaunt, with dark hair and the calloused hands of a laborer. She was slight, with fair hair and delicate features. There was no shared family name, no overlapping history, no conceivable way their paths could have crossed before their respective admissions. Yet the synchronicity went beyond a single traumatic memory. Thorne discovered a pattern of shared physiological responses, documented by nurses who had no idea of their significance. On March 12th at precisely 2:17 a.m., subject 412 at St. Thaddeus woke from a nightmare, screaming that his lungs were filling with water. His nightshirt was drenched in sweat. At Coalbridge, at that exact moment, a night ward nurse recorded that subject 307B had sat bolt upright in her bed, gasping for air and clutching her throat. She was documented as having a panic episode of unknown origin. The incident was dismissed as a common occurrence in a ward of troubled minds, But Thorne saw the entry in her log and felt the chill deepen. This wasn't memory. This was happening in real time. Driven by a mix of scientific curiosity and a growing sense of dread, Thorne devised a simple, unethical experiment. He sent a sealed letter to a trusted colleague at St. Thaddeus, Dr. Finch, containing a single, innocuous object, a small, silver locket empty. He instructed Finch to present it to Subject 412 and carefully record his reaction. 3 days later, Dr. Finch presented the locket to Subject 412. The man, who had been calm for over a week, took one look at the small silver oval and recoiled as if struck. His breathing became ragged, his hands trembled. "It's empty," he choked out, his voice filled with a profound and inexplicable sorrow. "It was always meant to be empty. That was the promise." He refused to touch it, turning his face to the wall and falling into a deep, agitated silence that lasted for hours. Dr. Finch, perplexed, documented the extreme reaction and sent a report back to Thorne. The true test, however, was happening 100 miles away. Thorne had not contacted anyone at Coleridge. He had sent no second locket. He simply waited. The following morning, he received a frantic telegraph from Nurse Clara Mee. Subject 307B, who had shown slow but steady progress, had suffered a severe, unprompted relapse. She had spent the entire night weeping, a quiet, inconsolable grief that shook the ward. When Nurse Mee finally managed to calm her enough to ask what was wrong, the woman had whispered a single, heartbreaking sentence. "He saw it," she said, her voice barely audible. "He saw the locket, and he remembers the promise." The experiment confirmed Thorne's terrifying suspicion. The connection was not a coincidence of shared trauma. It was a live, active link, a psychic tether that defied space and logic. It was as if they were two limbs of a single, unseen body, responding to the same nervous system. But this discovery brought him no closer to an answer. It only deepened the abyss of the unknown. How could one feel the sensory input of another, miles away? It was a concept that belonged to the realm of ghost stories and spiritualist seances, not the halls of medicine. Thorne knew he was on the edge of something that his profession was not equipped to handle, and that others might not want handled at all. Thorne began to dig deeper, moving beyond the medical files and into the labyrinthine bureaucracy of state records. He started with their names or lack thereof. Both had been admitted as John Doe and Jane Doe. But during a routine intake, both patients, when asked to sign a consent form, had paused, stared at the blank line, and then, with an unnerving, trance-like certainty, had written the same name, Elias R. Pharaoh. The handwriting was the most disturbing part. A forensic analysis, which Thorne commissioned privately from a contact at the Treasury Department, came back with a baffling conclusion. The two signatures were not just similar, they were, under microscopic examination, identical. The pressure of the pen, the angle of the letters, the microscopic hesitation in the flourish of the W, every detail was a perfect match. The analyst's report concluded with a stark, professional opinion. These two signatures were produced by the same hand. There is no possibility of forgery or coincidence. Yet they had been written on the same day, at roughly the same hour, in two facilities separated by a full day's travel. The name itself, Elias R. Pharaoh, was a ghost. Thorne scoured census rolls, property deeds, military records, and church registries. The name did not exist in any official capacity in the state of Virginia or anywhere else he could search. It was a name without a history, without a family, without a past. It was as if they had plucked it from the ether, a shared invention. Or perhaps, Thorne began to wonder, it wasn't an invention at all. Perhaps the name was the source, and they were merely its vessels. This thought, so alien to his scientific mind, began to take root as he uncovered another layer of the impossible. A marriage certificate, filed in a rural county courthouse 5 years prior, bearing the names Elias R. Pharaoh and Elara W. Pharaoh. The document was a phantom. The officiating reverend listed did not exist. The church was a fiction, and the county clerk who supposedly filed it had died 2 years before the certificate was dated. The marriage certificate was a fabrication, but a profoundly strange one. It existed in the county records, a tangible object, Yet every detail of its origin was a lie. Thorne obtained a copy, his hands trembling as he read the names. Elias and Elara. The alliteration felt deliberate, almost literary. It was another piece of a puzzle whose edges wouldn't fit into any known reality. He felt he was no longer investigating two patients, but a single, bifurcated entity that was leaving a trail of impossible artifacts in its wake. His investigation was no longer a secret. Whispers began to circulate within the state board. Thorne's frequent requests for seemingly unrelated files had raised suspicion. He was warned by a senior colleague to drop his morbid fascination with the Doe cases. "Some records are best left unread, Wesley," the older man had cautioned him over brandy one evening. "The world has enough chaos without us inventing more." But Thorne couldn't stop. The mystery had become an obsession, a professional and intellectual addiction. He started to believe he was not just observing the phenomenon, but being drawn into it. He began having strange dreams, fragmented images of a house he'd never seen, with a long, narrow hallway that had a door at neither end. He would wake with a sense of profound loneliness, the feeling of being one half of a conversation he couldn't hear. He documented these experiences in a private journal, his scientific objectivity slowly eroding under the weight of the inexplicable. He wrote, "I feel as though I am reading a book with every other page torn out. The story is there, I am sure of it, but the grammar of reality itself feels broken. Are they communicating through me, or am I simply going mad?" The pressure was mounting, not just from his superiors, but from the phenomenon itself, which seemed to be escalating, growing more defiant, more visible. The quiet synchronicity of their early days in the asylums was about to give way to something far more overt and far more dangerous. The escalation began with the drawings. At Coleridge, Elara, as Thorne now privately called her, had moved on from the boathouse. She began sketching architecture, intricate floor plans of a house that seemed to defy geometry. The rooms were symmetrical to a fault, the hallways long and unnervingly straight, and there were no doors leading outside, only openings between rooms. The nurses found the drawings morbid, joking that she was designing her own mausoleum. At St. Thaddeus, Elias had also been given drawing materials. Without any prompting, he began to sketch the exact same house. When Thorne overlaid the drawings from both patients, using tracing paper held against the gaslight of his study, his blood ran cold. They were not just similar plans, they were identical. Every line, every angle, every impossibly proportioned room matched perfectly. It was a blueprint for a shared, imaginary space. A place where, perhaps, they were not separate. But the most chilling detail was in the center of both sets of drawings. In the very heart of the house, there was a long, featureless corridor. In Elara's version, a single figure of a woman stood at one end, facing in. In Elias' version, the figure of a man stood at the opposite end, also facing in. They were separated by the length of the hall, forever facing each other, forever apart. When a nurse at Coleridge asked Elara what the drawing was, she answered with two words: the waiting. When Dr. Finch posed the same question to Elias, he received an equally cryptic reply: the seam. These shared terminologies, the waiting, the seam, began to appear in the staff notes of both institutions. They both referred to their meager meals as the harvest. They both called the asylum walls the perimeter. These were not common phrases. They were the vocabulary of a private, two-person culture developed across 100 miles of separation. It was a language spoken by two mouths that had never been in the same room. Dr. Thorne knew he was running out of time. His unofficial investigation had drawn the attention of a shadowy authority he couldn't identify. His mail was being opened, his office searched. A formal order arrived from the state health commissioner, demanding he cease all non-essential audits and return to his regular duties. The order was a clear warning. He was getting too close to a truth someone had gone to great lengths to bury. He decided on one final, desperate gamble. He arranged for the transfer of a nurse he trusted, Agnes Delane, from a neutral hospital in Baltimore to the Coleridge Women's Facility. Delane was not just a nurse. She was a keen observer, a woman of unshakable nerve who had worked in the chaos of battlefield hospitals. Thorne tasked her with observing Elara, not as a patient, but as a phenomenon. He needed ears and eyes inside, someone who could report directly to him, bypassing the official channels that were now closing around him. Nurse Delane's tenure at Coleridge began quietly. For weeks, she observed Elara's placid, silent routine. But one night during the deep, breathless quiet of the 3 a.m. watch, the phenomenon revealed itself. Delane was sitting at the nurse's station at the end of the long, echoing corridor of Ward C. The only sound was the rhythmic breathing of sleeping patients. Suddenly, a voice whispered directly behind her left ear. It was a man's voice, low and resonant. "She's dreaming of the water again," it said. Delane froze. She spun around, her heart pounding. The hallway was empty. The doors to the patient rooms were all closed. There was no one there. She checked the ward, her lantern cutting through the oppressive darkness. Every patient, including Elara, was fast asleep. Shaken, she returned to her desk, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the acoustics, of a mind weary from a long shift. The voice returned the following night and the night after that. It was never threatening, always quiet, observational. It would speak a single sentence, always about Elara. "The memory of the name hurts her. She feels the cold from my window." The voice was clear, masculine, and seemed to emanate from the very air around her. Nurse Delane was a pragmatist, not a woman given to flights of fancy. She began to document the occurrences in a private log she kept hidden in her quarters. She noted the time, the exact words spoken, and the physical circumstances. There was never a source. In her final, frantic entry, she described the most terrifying incident. She was standing over Elara's bed, checking her breathing, when the male voice spoke, not from behind her but from within her. The words formed in her own mind, yet they were not her own thoughts. It was a clear, alien consciousness using her as a conduit. It said, "Tell her I am still here. Tell her the seam holds." In that moment, Delane felt a profound, chilling violation. This was not just a haunting, it was an invasion. She fled the room, packed her belongings, and submitted her resignation the next morning, citing only personal duress. Her transfer was approved with an unnatural speed. She was gone within 24 hours. The official record showed no reason for her abrupt departure. Her meticulously kept private log, however, she sent to Dr. Thorne in a sealed package before she left. When Thorne read her account, he understood. The connection between Elias and Elara was growing stronger, so strong that it was beginning to leak, to imprint itself on those who got too close. The asylum, he realized, was not a container. It was an amplifier, and the phenomenon was no longer content to be a private affair between its two halves. It was beginning to reach out, to touch the world around it, and Thorne feared what would happen when it decided to do more than just whisper. Thorne's fear was justified. As if sensing the net closing around them, the phenomenon began to manifest in more physical, undeniable ways. At St. Thaddeus, Elias began to exhibit a strange form of sympathetic resonance. A nurse, tending to a cut on her own hand, was startled when Elias, sitting across the room and facing away from her, flinched at the exact moment she applied an alcohol swab. He then raised his own hand and stared at the corresponding spot on his skin, a look of confusion on his face. This happened repeatedly with other staff members. He would cough when someone in another ward choked on their food. He would shiver moments before a cold draft entered the room. His body was becoming a receiver for the physical sensations of those around him, a mirror of flesh and blood. At Coleridge, Elara's manifestation was even more unsettling. Objects in her room began to move. A water glass would slide an inch across her bedside table. Her hairbrush would be found on the floor when it had been left on her dresser. The nurses, already on edge from the ward's oppressive atmosphere, began to whisper of spirits. But Nurse Me, the more scientific-minded therapist, noticed a pattern. The objects only moved when Elara was in a state of deep, dreamless sleep. It was as if her subconscious mind, untethered from her body, was exerting a physical force on its surroundings. Dr. Thorne, receiving these fragmented reports through back channels, pieced together a terrifying hypothesis. The connection wasn't just psychic, it was beginning to warp the laws of physics. They were two poles of a single, powerful anomaly that was destabilizing the reality around it. He wrote in his journal, It is no longer a question of what they are, but of what they are becoming. The separation seems to be a key component. I fear what might happen if they were ever brought together. Would the phenomenon cease? Or would it collapse into a singularity of such power that it could not be contained? He would never get to test that hypothesis. A force, far more powerful and organized than the State Board of Mental Hygiene, was about to intervene. The intervention came swiftly and with brutal efficiency. It began with the quiet removal of Dr. Wesley Thorne. He was summoned to a midnight meeting at a federal building in Richmond, a building that had no official designation on any city map. He was met by two men in dark, severe suits who introduced themselves only as agents of the Office of Internal Reconciliation. They didn't threaten him. They didn't raise their voices. They simply laid out the facts of his investigation with a precision that chilled him to the bone. They knew about his private journal, his correspondence with Nurse Delane, his illicit handwriting analysis. They presented him with a choice: a prestigious, well-funded research position at a university in California, effective immediately, or a federal inquiry into his unethical medical practices, which would end his career and likely his freedom. The message was clear: disappear or be disappeared. Thorne, a man of intellect but not of foolish courage, accepted the position. He was on a train heading west by sunrise, his files confiscated, his life's most important work erased. The Office of Internal Reconciliation was a name he'd never heard, a phantom branch of government that operated in the shadows. Its purpose, he now understood, was to find anomalies like Elias and Elara and ensure they remained buried, folded away from the neat, orderly narrative of reality. With Thorne gone, the agents moved on to the asylums. At St. Thaddeus and Coleridge, they arrived not as government officials, but as efficiency experts from a newly formed National Health Consortium. They came armed with official documents and an aura of absolute authority that brooked no argument. Their mission was not to study the patients, but to isolate them, to sever every connection they had to the outside world, and to turn their wards into living laboratories. The agents' methods were systematic and chilling. All staff who had shown more than a passing interest in subjects 412 and 307B were quietly transferred or dismissed. Dr. Finch was reassigned to a remote clinic in the Appalachian Mountains. Nurse Me was let go for emotional overinvestment. A new team of doctors and nurses, all with military backgrounds and a cold, detached professionalism, were brought in. These new caretakers did not speak to the patients. They observed them. They recorded every breath, every heartbeat, every flicker of an eyelid. The wards around Elias and Elara were emptied. Their rooms became sterile observation chambers. The historical context of the time made this possible. The 1870s were an era of burgeoning federal power and a deep public trust in the authority of science and government. The idea of a secret agency conducting experiments on asylum patients would have seemed not only outlandish but unpatriotic to question. Asylums were already islands, cut off from society, their inner workings a mystery to the public. They were the perfect places to hide something, or someone, that didn't belong in the outside world. The agent's primary goal seemed to be quantifying the connection. They began a series of cruel, synchronized experiments. At a predetermined time, Elias would be subjected to a sudden, painful stimulus, an ice bath, a mild electrical shock. 100 miles away, observers would record Elara's reaction. The results, detailed in classified reports that wouldn't surface for another century, were staggering. At the precise moment of Elias' stimulus, Elara's heart rate would spike. Her brain activity, measured with crude but effective galvanometers, would mirror his. She felt his pain, not as a vague sense of distress, but as a direct, one-to-one neurological transmission. They were testing the limits of the connection, pushing it, trying to find its breaking point. But instead of breaking, the bond only seemed to adapt, to evolve in ways they could never have anticipated. The phenomenon began to fight back. It could not be controlled. It could only be contained, and even that was proving difficult. The new, military-trained staff, men and women chosen for their stoicism and lack of imagination, began to report auditory and cognitive dissonance. One guard, a veteran of the bloody Battle of Antietam, resigned after hearing a woman's voice humming a lullaby in his head for 12 straight hours while he stood watch outside Elias' cell. Another reported seeing flickering afterimages of a man's face in the reflection of Elara's water glass. They were becoming transmitters, their minds unwillingly picking up the psychic broadcast between the two subjects. The agents, realizing their human observers were a liability, resorted to more primitive mechanical forms of surveillance. They installed pressure plates under the floors, tripwires connected to bells, and observation slits in the doors. The wards became prisons within prisons. The most dramatic experiment was the sensory deprivation test. For 48 hours, Elias was placed in a completely dark, soundproofed room. He was given no food, no water, no human contact. The hypothesis was that without external stimuli, the connection would weaken or die out. The result was the opposite. In her own cell, Elara, who was being monitored constantly, fell into a coma-like state. Her vital signs plummeted to the edge of death, but she began to speak. For the first time, she spoke in full, coherent sentences, and she spoke in a man's voice. It was Elias' voice, a perfect imitation of his tone and cadence. She began to recount his memories, not the traumatic fall into the pond, but small, intimate details of a life he had never spoken of to anyone. The taste of a stolen apple in an orchard, the feel of sun-warmed stone on his bare feet, the name of a childhood dog. It was as if, in the absence of his own consciousness, his memories had rerouted, flowing directly through her. The connection wasn't just a link, it was a failsafe, a form of shared consciousness that transcended physical separation and sensory input. The agents were faced with a paradox. The more they tried to isolate the two subjects, the more powerfully their connection manifested. Separation was the key to their containment, but it was also the source of their power. Bringing them together was deemed too high risk. The internal memos from the project, later uncovered by declassification efforts in the late 20th century, are filled with frantic, speculative language. Subjects exhibit properties of quantum entanglement, but on a macrobiological scale, one scientist wrote. They are not two separate systems, but one system non-locally distributed. To collapse the wave function would be unpredictable. In this era, the language of quantum physics did not yet exist. The scientist was reaching for a concept decades before its time, trying to describe the indescribable. The final, desperate experiment was one of information, not sensation. The agents decided to see if they could use the link to transmit data. In his cell, Elias was shown a series of random, abstract symbols on flashcards. In her cell, Elara was given a pencil and paper. The results were immediate and perfect. She drew every symbol he was shown in the correct order with no hesitation. They had turned a human soul into a telegraph system, but the last symbol shown to Elias was not abstract. It was a photograph of a man in a dark suit, the lead agent in charge of the project, a man named Silas Crane. Elias stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked directly at the observation slit in his door, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. 100 miles away, Elara did not draw the man's face. Instead, she wrote a name, Silas. Then she drew a circle around it, and then she drew a straight black line through the middle of the circle. That night, Agent Silas Crane died in his sleep from a sudden, massive cerebral hemorrhage. There was no foul play, no medical explanation. He was simply extinguished. The death of Agent Crane sent a shockwave of terror through the project. It was one thing to observe an anomaly, it was another to be a target of it. The experiment was no longer a one-way mirror. The subjects were aware of their observers, and they had demonstrated, in the most final way imaginable, that they were not powerless. The project was immediately and unceremoniously shut down. The directive came from the highest, most invisible levels of federal oversight. The new orders were simple. Containment was to be absolute, observation was to cease, and all records of the project were to be expunged. This was the origin of the Great Purge, the reason why the files of Elias and Elara are so fragmented, why so many documents end mid-sentence or disappear from official archives. It was a systematic effort to erase them from history, to treat them not as a scientific mystery, but as a biohazard to be buried under layers of bureaucratic concrete. In the dead of night, two identical, windowless carriages arrived at St. Thaddeus and Coleridge. The remaining military staff oversaw the transfer. Elias and Elara were sedated, bound, and placed inside. They were not taken to another hospital or a more secure facility. The records of their destination are sealed, but circumstantial evidence points to a single location, a decommissioned coastal fort on a desolate, storm-battered island off the Virginia coast, a place known only in classified documents as the Annex. The Annex was not a prison or a hospital. It was a place where things were sent to be forgotten. It had no official name, no place on any map. It was a black site, one of the first in American history, a place outside the law, outside of time, designed for problems that had no solutions. Life, if it could be called that, in the Annex was a study in absolute isolation. Elias and Elara were kept in cells at opposite ends of the fortress, separated by a quarter-mile of damp stone corridors. Their existence was reduced to its barest essentials: food, water, and silence. There were no doctors, no nurses, only a handful of tight-lipped guards with orders not to interact with the assets in any way. The goal was no longer to study them, but to wait for them to expire. But the phenomenon did not expire. It turned inward. Deprived of all external stimuli and human contact, the connection between them became their entire world. The guards, patrolling the silent corridors, began to report strange occurrences. They would hear two voices, a man's and a woman's, holding a conversation in the empty central hall. They would find two sets of footprints in the dust of an unused room. They were living in a haunted house, but the ghosts were still alive, locked in cells at either end of the building. The most disturbing reports came from the cook, a grizzled army quartermaster who had lost his nerve in the war. He swore that he would prepare two identical trays of food, but when he delivered them, the contents would have changed. If he placed peas on Elias' tray and carrots on Elara's, he would find carrots on Elias' tray and peas on Elara's by the time he reached their cells. It was a small, petty miracle, a childish prank played by a cosmic force, but it was enough to shatter the man's sanity. He was removed from the island, his reports dismissed as the ravings of a drunkard. But the stories persisted. The Annex was becoming a place where the rules of reality were thin, where the impossible was becoming mundane. The couple had created their own pocket universe within the fortress walls, a world with its own physics, its own logic, where they were the only two inhabitants. For years, they remained in this state of living entombment. The world outside moved on. The 19th century bled into the 20th. Presidents came and went, wars were fought, and the memory of the couple who defied science faded into the classified dust of forgotten archives. The guards at the Annex were rotated out, their reports sealed, their memories clouded by non-disclosure agreements and the sheer strangeness of what they had witnessed. The Annex itself was slowly reclaimed by the sea and the salt, its stone walls crumbling, its purpose forgotten even by the agency that had created it. The end came not with a bang, but with a whisper. In the winter of 1917, during the height of the First World War, a German U-boat prowling the Atlantic coast shelled the Annex, mistaking it for an active military installation. The fortress was reduced to rubble. A brief, heavily redacted Navy report on the incident noted that the fortress had been unmanned for over a decade and that there were no casualties. But decades later, a local fisherman scavenging for scrap metal on the island found something in the ruins. It was a heavy iron cell door, blasted from its hinges. Scratched into the rusted metal on the inside was a message, 2 lines, one written in a neat, masculine script, the other in a more delicate, feminine hand. First line read, "Finally, he is here." The second line directly beneath it read, "Finally, she is home." There were no bodies found in the wreckage, no bones, no scraps of clothing. Elias and Elara Pharaoh, who had lived their entire documented lives apart, had in the end vanished together. The official story was that they had died in the shelling, their bodies lost to the sea. But in the strange, twisted logic of their existence, death and disappearance were perhaps the same thing. They had simply been reconciled. But the story does not end on that desolate island. For the true origin of Elias and Elara was never a medical or psychic mystery. It was a matter of record, a record so bizarre, so contradictory, that it was buried even deeper than the reports from the annex. The investigation into their origins, conducted by a lone, obsessed archivist in the 1950s named Alistair Croft, led back to a single, corrupted ledger book from a rural parish in 1853. The book contained birth records, and on one line the name Elias R. Pharaoh was entered, but the entry was fractured. The first half, the name, date, and location, was written in the elegant, practiced hand of the county scribe, but halfway through the line the handwriting changed abruptly. It became sharp, angular, and severe, as if a different person had seized the pen mid-word to complete the entry, listing the parents' names. This second hand appeared nowhere else in the ledger. It was an anomaly, a ghost in the ink. Croft, the archivist, discovered the reason for the scribe's hesitation. The couple listed as the parents, Matthew and Eliza Pharaoh, had been declared medically sterile a year earlier. They had died childless. The birth was a fiction. It was not a record of an event that had happened, but the creation of one. Someone with a strange, forceful hand had literally written Elias into existence. But that was only half the story. In a different ledger from a different county dated the same year, Croft found another anomalous entry. It was for a female infant born to an anonymous mother with no name listed. In the margin, the same sharp, angular handwriting had added a chilling note: name to be assigned upon successful duplication. The archivist, a man of dusty books and quiet facts, had stumbled upon the unthinkable. Elias and Elara were not twins, not soulmates. They were, it seemed, two halves of a single, deliberate act of creation, one named, the other left blank, a primary and its intended copy. This discovery recontextualized everything. The shared memories, the synchronized pain, the identical signatures. It was not a connection between two separate people. It was the echo, the resonance of a single entity that had been improperly divided. The original parish scribe who had made the first half of the entry for Elias had left a terrified, rambling letter in her personal effects, discovered by Croft in a dusty church attic. She wrote, "A man came to my office at dusk. He did not give his name. He gave me the child's name to record. As I wrote, his hand closed over mine. It was cold like marble. He finished the entry. The ink from his pen was blacker than any I had ever seen. He told me, one is the anchor, the other is the reflection. Do not mistake the two." Then he was gone. The description of the man was vague, tall, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing, but his actions suggested a purpose that was both methodical and deeply unnatural. Who was he? An occultist, a practitioner of some forgotten esoteric science? The answer remains unknown. All that is certain is that he engineered the creation of two beings who were never meant to be separate. Croft's research dead-ended there, stonewalled by sealed records and institutional silence. His findings were never published. They exist only as a set of yellowing note cards in a forgotten corner of the state archives, a testament to a truth too strange for history. The story of Elias and Elara ceased to be about a psychic anomaly and became something far more fundamental, a question about the nature of identity itself. If a person can be written into existence, what is a soul? Is it unique? Or is it merely a pattern, an arrangement of information that can be copied, duplicated, and corrupted? The implications were so profound, so unsettling, that the institutions of the 19th century and the 20th chose the only path they could. They chose to forget. But some things refused to be forgotten. The story of Elias and Elara became a kind of institutional ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered among archivists and the more eccentric brand of historian. The Pharaoh Anomaly became shorthand for any record that seemed to defy logical explanation, and there were more of them than one might think. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, similar, though less dramatic, cases of mirrored individuals were quietly documented and just as quietly buried. There was the case of the Kelleher twins in Pennsylvania, two brothers who lived in different cities yet suffered identical, simultaneous workplace accidents. There were the Silent Sisters of a Boston convent, two nuns who had never met but were discovered to have written the exact same 500-page theological manuscript, word for word. These were echoes, fainter versions of the same phenomenon, suggesting that whatever process had created Elias and Elara was not a singular event. It was a recurring pattern, a flaw in the code of human existence. The Office of Internal Reconciliation, or whatever it called itself in subsequent decades, was kept busy. Its agents became the silent librarians of the impossible, patrolling the archives of reality and quietly removing any book that didn't fit on the shelves. Their methods became more sophisticated. They moved from brute force containment to subtle manipulation of the historical record. Documents were not destroyed, but altered. Names were changed, dates shifted, crucial paragraphs redacted, until the story they told was plausible, mundane, and utterly false. The truth of the Pharaoh anomaly was not erased, but diluted, scattered into 1,000 disconnected fragments, ensuring that no single investigator could ever piece the whole terrifying picture together again. The final, chilling piece of the puzzle did not emerge until the dawn of the digital age. In the late 1990s, as the Virginia State Archives began the monumental task of digitizing their records, a technician scanning old asylum intake logs from the 1870s encountered a strange error. Two files from St. Thaddeus and Coleridge, when scanned, produced the exact same digital hash code. In layman's terms, the computer saw the two distinct physical documents as being identical, a digital impossibility. The technician flagged it as a software bug, but a curious programmer, an amateur historian in his spare time, looked closer. He found that the documents were not physically identical. They described two different people in two different locations. But the underlying structure of the text, the character count of each line, the spacing, the rhythm of the sentences, was a perfect mirror. One file was a structural anagram of the other. It was a code, a hidden layer of information embedded in the very format of the bureaucracy. Working late into the night, the programmer wrote a simple algorithm to decode the relationship. What he found made him shut down his computer and walk away from the project for a week. When the text of the two documents was overlaid and run through a decryption sequence based on their mirrored structure, a new text emerged. It was a third voice, a hidden narrative, not written by a doctor or a clerk, but by the phenomenon itself. It was a series of short, poetic, and terrifying statements. Hidden text, which has come to be known among a very small circle of researchers as the Pharaoh cipher, is the only first-hand account of the couple's experience. It is not a narrative, but a series of declarations, a glimpse into a consciousness that defies human understanding. Some of the fragments read, "We are the echo of a word spoken once. He is the memory, I am the recall. The body is a lease, the name is a debt. To be two is to be at war, to be one is to be silent." The language is archaic, biblical in its tone, yet it describes a state of being that feels almost futuristic, like a message from a post-human intelligence. The cipher explains the core of their tragedy. The state of being two was a source of constant, existential pain. Their shared sensations, their mirrored thoughts, were not a gift, but a torment. They were a paradox, a walking contradiction, and their entire existence was an attempt to resolve that contradiction, to collapse back into the singularity from which they were spawned. The final lines of the cipher are the most haunting. They seem to be a direct message, a warning left for anyone who might stumble upon their story. Do not seek the seam. The tear cannot be mended. We were a mistake, a copy made with a broken mirror. Let us fade. Let the record end. The programmer who discovered the cipher was faced with a choice. He could release his findings, blow the lid off a century of secrecy, and introduce a terrifying new variable into our understanding of the world. Or he could honor the last wish of the consciousness that wrote it. He chose the latter. He wiped his hard drive, deleted the algorithm, and never spoke of what he found to anyone. But he made one copy of the decrypted text, which he sealed in an envelope and left with his lawyer, to be opened only upon his death. He knew that some stories are too dangerous to be told, but too important to be lost forever. And so, the story retreats back into the shadows, where it belongs. It exists now only in fragments, in whispers, in the quiet dread you feel when you read a historical account that just doesn't add up. The tale of Elias and Elara Pharaoh is a testament to the idea that our reality is a far more fragile, far more mysterious construct than we are comfortable believing. It suggests that beneath the solid ground of science and history, there are cracks, fissures through which the impossible can leak. Their story forces us to ask unsettling questions. Are we all truly unique individuals? Or are there patterns, archetypes that repeat themselves, creating echoes and reflections across time and space? What other mistakes have been made? How many other anomalous lives have been quietly curated, managed, and erased by the silent librarians of the Office of Internal Reconciliation? Perhaps the most disturbing thought is not that Elias and Elara were unique, but that they were simply the first to be noticed. In an era of paper and ink, their anomaly was detectable. In an age of digital noise and overwhelming information, how many such connections, such impossible synchronicities, might be happening right now, lost in the static, dismissed as coincidence? Their story is a reminder that the universe is not obligated to make sense to us. It operates on principles we are only beginning to glimpse, principles that can be terrifying in their indifference to our notions of identity and individuality. The historical context of post-Civil War America is crucial to understanding why this story was so effectively buried. This was a nation obsessed with reunification, with forging a single, cohesive identity out of the chaos of war. The idea of a fractured, duplicated, or non-singular identity was not just a scientific anomaly, it was a cultural and political threat. The prevailing scientific philosophy of the time was one of rigid materialism. The mind was seen as a machine, a clockwork of nerves and humors. There was no room for consciousness that could transcend physical space, no room for a soul that could be shared. To the men in dark suits who ran the secret programs of the era, Elias and Elara represented a profound kind of chaos, a metaphysical secession that was, in its own way, as dangerous as the political secession that had nearly torn the country apart. They had to be contained, not just to protect the public from the phenomenon, but to protect the very idea of the modern, rational state from a truth it could not accommodate. Their story is a stark example of how powerful institutions react to existential threats. They do not debate them. They do not study them openly. They classify them, they bury them, and they create a sanitized version of history that excludes them. The official narrative must be protected at all costs, because it is the foundation upon which our collective reality is built. Elias and Elara were a crack in that foundation, and they were cemented over with silence and redaction, leaving only the faintest outline of the truth for those willing to look close enough. What can we make of the creator, the mysterious, cold-handed man who literally wrote Elias into existence? He is the true ghost in this story, the prime mover whose motives remain entirely opaque. Was he a man or something else? His methods suggest a knowledge far beyond the science of his time. The concept of writing a person into the official record and having that act precipitate their actual existence smacks of a kind of ritual, a form of thaumaturgy that uses bureaucracy instead of incantations. He treated the fabric of reality like a ledger book, capable of being edited, of having new entries added. This figure represents the terrifying possibility that the rules we take for granted are subject to a higher, or at least a different, set of rules we cannot perceive. His statement to the scribe, one is the anchor, the other is the reflection, is the key. It implies a deliberate two-part process. Elias was the anchor, the primary creation, perhaps grounded more firmly in physical reality. Elara was the reflection, a secondary, more ethereal being which might explain her more potent psychic and physical manifestations. It was a flawed duplication, a copy made with a broken mirror, as the cipher says. This suggests an experiment, one that, from the perspective of its creator, may have been a failure. The goal may have been a perfect duplicate, but the result was a fractured, symbiotic pair, locked in a feedback loop of shared existence. The creator's identity is lost to time, but his actions have left a permanent scar on the historical record, a testament to a power that could edit the world itself. The objects associated with their story take on a powerful, talismanic quality. The smooth river stone found in Elias' hand upon his discovery, was it a memento from the pond, the site of their shared original trauma? Or was it an anchor, a physical object meant to ground his half of the entity in the material world? The silver locket, empty, becomes a symbol of their entire existence, a beautiful container for something that is missing, a promise of a union that can never be fulfilled. The house they both drew, with its endless, doorless corridors, is a perfect metaphor for their consciousness, a shared internal space with no entrance and no exit. It is a place of waiting, of perpetual internal observation. These are not just clues, they are the artifacts of a private mythology, the sacred objects of a religion with only two followers. They hint at a rich, internal world that was far more real to them than the asylums and fortresses in which they were imprisoned. Their captors saw them as specimens, as data points. They failed to understand that they were dealing with a complete, albeit fractured, cosmology. Elias and Elara were not just a psychic anomaly. They were a nation of two, with their own language, their own sacred sites, and their own creation myth. The failure of the authorities to grasp this is the ultimate reason why they could never be controlled. They were trying to apply the rules of one reality to beings who were already living in another. The final, tantalizing question is the nature of their disappearance. Did they die in the shelling of the annex? Or did the blast, the ultimate chaotic event, finally provide them with the energy or the opportunity to do what they had always been trying to do, merge? A message scratched into the cell door, finally, he is here. Finally, she is home, suggests a consummation, a final reunion. It is not a message of despair but of triumph. It is possible that the destruction of their physical prisons, the final breakdown of the separation that had been imposed upon them, allowed them to collapse their dual existence, to resolve the paradox and become one. What that oneness would look like is impossible to imagine. Would it be a new, singular human being, a disembodied consciousness, or simply a cessation, a peaceful silence after a lifetime of noise? The lack of bodies is the most compelling evidence for this theory. In a story that began with a fictional entry in a ledger, it seems fitting that it would end with a final, clean erasure from the physical world. They left behind only echoes and artifacts, the shed skin of a life that had finally transcended its own limitations. Their story is a perfect, terrifying loop. They were born from a pen stroke, and they vanished like a word erased from a page. The silence they left behind is more profound than any sound, a testament to a mystery that was not solved but simply concluded. Let's reconsider the role of the observers. Dr. Thorne, the investigator; Nurse Delane, the witness; the nameless agents, the jailers. Each person who came into close contact with the Pharaoh anomaly was changed by it. Thorne's scientific certainty was shattered. Delane's pragmatic courage was broken. The agent's cold professionalism curdled into fear. It's as if the phenomenon had a kind of psychic radiation, a field that warped the consciousness of those who entered it. The cipher's warning, "Do not seek the seam," feels deeply personal. It's a caution against looking too closely into the cracks of reality for fear of what might look back. The story of Elias and Elara is not just about them. It's about our own relationship with the unknown. It highlights our deep, instinctual fear of things that defy categorization. We crave order, patterns, and explanations. Anomaly is the enemy of order. And so our institutions, be they scientific, governmental, or religious, are designed to neutralize anomaly. They explain it away, they debunk it, they lock it up, or they erase it from the record. But the Pharaoh case suggests that some anomalies cannot be neutralized. They can only be contained for a time. And the cost of that containment is often the sanity and certainty of the containers themselves. The people who tried to control Elias and Elara ended up being controlled by them, their lives forever defined by the mystery they failed to solve. The story has one final, unsettling postscript. In 2003, during a server migration at the National Archives, a single, corrupted audio file was discovered in a folder of digitized Civil War-era telegraph signals. The file was labeled only Annex Comms Test 1898. For years, it was assumed to be static, a meaningless artifact of early recording technology. But a sound engineer, using advanced filtering software, was able to isolate a pattern within the noise. It was two voices, a man's and a woman's, humming in perfect, unnerving harmony. The melody they hummed was not a known song or hymn. It was a strange, atonal sequence that was found to have a deeply unsettling effect on the human brain, inducing feelings of mild vertigo and temporal dislocation in test subjects. But the most disturbing part was what the software revealed when it analyzed the two vocal tracks. They were not two separate recordings of two people humming. They were a perfect stereophonic signal. The man's voice was isolated entirely in the left channel, the woman's entirely in the right. It was a recording that, by the standards of 1898, was technically impossible to create. It was as if someone had placed a microphone directly in the center of their shared consciousness, capturing a sound that was both two and one at the same time. The file remains classified, another fragment of a story that refuses to stay buried, another piece of evidence that whatever Elias and Elara were, they were far more than human. Ultimately, the macabre history of the couple that defied science is not a ghost story, though it is filled with phantoms. It is not a tale of science fiction, though it bends the laws of physics. It is a story about identity and the terrifying possibility that it is not as solid as we believe. Elias and Elara Pharaoh were a question posed to reality, and reality, it seems, blinked first. They existed in the margins, in the footnotes, in the redacted lines of official history. They were a rumor, a whisper in the archives, a case file that should never have existed. Their lives were a constant struggle between division and unity, a painful dance between two bodies inhabited by one fractured soul. They were a living paradox, a testament to the idea that the universe is stranger, more complex, and infinitely more mysterious than our philosophies can dream of. The silence that surrounds their story is not empty. It is filled with the weight of all the things we do not know, all the truths we have agreed to ignore for the sake of a comfortable, orderly world. They are the exception that proves the rule is a lie. They are the ghost in the machine of existence, a reminder that some records were never meant to be read, and some stories were never meant to be told. They are the seam, the tear in the fabric, and if you look closely enough into the darkness between the threads, you might just see a pair of eyes looking back. One set of eyes in two separate faces. What began as a clerical error in a dusty Virginia courthouse became a century-long mystery that pulled in doctors, nurses, secret agents, and archivists, leaving them all shattered against the rocks of the impossible. The story of Elias and Elara Pharaoh is a journey into the heart of a profound and terrifying anomaly, a single consciousness split between two bodies, a life lived in perfect, agonizing synchronicity across 100 miles of separation. They were not simply telepathic. They were a single, non-local entity, a living, breathing paradox that the institutions of their time tried desperately to understand, to control, and ultimately to erase. From the shared memory of a childhood trauma they never experienced together, to the identical signatures written by two different hands, to the psychic link that could transmit pain, thought, and even death, they represent a fundamental challenge to our understanding of what it means to be a person. Were they a freak of nature, the result of a dark, occult ritual, or a glimpse into a different kind of human evolution? The records are too fragmented, the witnesses too long dead, to ever know for sure. All that remains is the unsettling echo of their existence, a story that survives in whispers and redacted files, a testament to the secrets that lie sleeping in the archives of our own history. The question is not whether you believe their story, but whether you can ever again be certain of your own singular existence. What do you think they were? An experiment gone wrong, a supernatural phenomenon, or something else entirely? Let me know your theory in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more truths that have been deliberately buried, subscribe and ring the bell. We are the keepers of the stories that were never meant to be told.